some interesting conversation.
I think it's particularly kind of skim a few things down. Hear anything good?
Yeah, absolutely. Say again?
You mentioned on Angus. Okay.
Yeah, he's been fine. He retired. What's that now? A couple of years ago, and he's doing well. But it's, yeah, that's right. Somewhere up. I can't quite recall where he ended up. But yeah, his wife had been unwell for a number of years before he finished, and I think needed a fair bit of care. I think his mobility was quite severely affected. So I think between that and probably this, job is like born a huge amount of academic admin load, and I think I'm sure that eventually we'll just get to the stage where we need to break. I really think that for you, we're part of the validation team, and so you heard the conversation. But I think that what has come out of that has been healthier model. I think what John Angus did was very self-sacrificial, but a lot of both the loads and the knowledge was all located at I think it's now much more.
Okay, I think, yeah. Well, I think he's a character that's very winsome and
yeah, I know.
You come through to Glasgow sometimes with these checking things.
Yeah. Okay, so a good colleague. Yeah.
Second. I stand up, people feel sit down.
The last. There's
if you could take a chair, please. We'll now get on. It was good to have that break. I think part of the joy of these things is just chatting and making and remaking connections. But now, I was going to say for something completely different. Although maybe we'll see some connections between what we just heard about the Covenanters and somebody who is only just church history. Andrew Walls, fairly recently deceased, and someone who many of us here can remember very well. And so I think that's going to add to the quality of the Q&A. So Alastair's going to take some time to lead on this, something that that's very much at the core of what Alastair is, as lecturer in Mission and New Testament at Edinburgh Theological Seminary, formerly of this parish. And then there were two kind of times you were here, and in the middle, which was a big middle, for a decade, you were in Eastern Cape, in South Africa, at Dumasani. You rose to the rank of principal there with great responsibility, and then came back here, and then were lured to the capital by the promise of great remuneration, no doubt. We couldn't match, and yet, he remains faithful all the same to the cause, and you're very much involved with the Tyndale Fellowship. Alastair, you've written on Colossians and Philemon. Your dissertation was on Matthew, so you range across the New Testament as well as doing this thing on mission. I don't know you do it all. Very impressed with your span, your range. You're going to speak to us on cultivating a global perspective, significance of Andrew Walls for Scotland's engagement with world Christianity. It's great to have you. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark, and good morning to you all. It's a pleasure to speak as part of this conference, and I'm grateful for the invitation. As Mark said, this is something a little different, partly because I speak not as a trained historian, so I come as an amateur with a particular interest in the figure of Andrew Walls, and I'm grateful for the invitation to speak a little bit more about him. And also because, as Mark has said, we are not looking at history of the distant past where no one has personal experience, but we're dealing with somebody who many of you will have known or heard. Some of you knew well. He's also somebody who you can access on YouTube and such like in a way that we cannot do with figures of history from before. So my title is Cultivating a Global Perspective, the Significance of Andrew F. Walls for Scotland's Engagement with World Christianity. The slide that you see is a photograph of Andrew Walls taken by myself somewhere around 2018, 2019, when I was first in Edinburgh. He was still actively presenting in seminars in New College into his late 80s, and indeed he was still at least present in academic activities until his early 90s. This photograph shows Professor Brian Stanley, who is now Emeritus Professor of World Christianity at New College, handing a copy of his book, which was published in 2018, to Andrew Walls, and it shows a connection. In some respects, my talk has relied very heavily on Brian Stanley's work, and you'll see his name coming up quite a bit. The connection between Brian Stanley and Andrew Walls is that Andrew Walls was the external examiner for Brian Stanley's Cambridge PhD. So there was a personal link academically, but also a personal link in terms of their friendship and in terms of Brian Stanley continuing in Andrew Walls' footsteps. So Stanley says, if there is one scholar who may justly be described as the inspirer and architect of the field of study now known as world Christianity, that person would be Professor Andrew F. Walls, OBE, DD, who died on August 12th, 2021, aged 93. Many tributes to Professor Andrew Walls were published following his death in August 2021. These typically highlighted the ways in which this unassuming scholar had a massive impact on the way in which Christianity is understood and studied globally. Less attention has been paid to the part that Andrew Walls played in fostering a global perspective in Scotland. This is perhaps surprising, since Walls worked primarily in the context of two Scottish universities, Aberdeen from 1966 to 1986, and then Edinburgh from 1986 to his retirement in 1997, and he maintained an active involvement in there long past his formal retirement. So in this talk, I wish to consider various ways in which Andrew Walls contributed to cultivating a global perspective, in inverted commas, in Scotland, following a sketch, following a definition of world Christianity, a personal reflection, and a brief biographical sketch. I'll discuss his impact on Scotland with respect to the local church, university departments, his colleagues, his undergraduate and postgraduate students, and his writings. Finally, I'll offer some reflections on what might be Professor Walls' enduring impact. Some of you may well be familiar with Professor Walls, others not so. And so this will be largely an introductory overview of some of his distinctive ideas and contributions. I hope that will be useful, and we can draw some other details out in conversation. So first of all, world Christianity, this phrase, what do we mean by that? World Christianity is a relatively recent term, and in current usage, it may refer both to an empirical ecclesial reality, that is, there is Christianity worldwide, and to an academic discipline which reflects on that reality. Andrew Walls comments on the term in the following way. This is in the introduction to a collection of essays which had world Christianity in the subtitle. I confess myself, he says, to be a late convert to the use of the term world Christianity itself, for it is not without dangers. The most obvious of these is that it can too readily be assumed to mean, quote, Christianity somewhere else, rather as world music means music from somewhere else. And supermarkets have aisles dedicated to world foods, meaning not what your mother used to give you. But no other term readily reflects the fact that Christianity is a significant presence in all 6 continents and, in principle, has always been addressed to the oikumene, the whole inhabited world. Let me give a quick personal note. I'd like to share a memory and a confession. In 1988, I moved to Edinburgh to begin a Bachelor of Arts degree in Religious Studies. And as part of the core of that programme, which included several weeks of classes on all the world's major religious traditions, I had a series of lectures given by Professor Andrew Walls. I recall the long climb up the stairs to the classroom high in what was then called the David Hume Tower in Edinburgh to hear Professor Walls speak on, quote, primal religions. Prior to the lectures, I had no idea what primal religions were, and I did not find the topic as immediately appealing or accessible as Islam, Hinduism, or Buddhism. Nonetheless, I attended the lectures and learned from Andrew Walls that primal religions, which might today be described as indigenous religions, reflected ancient religious traditions in various parts of the world, of which African traditional religion would be one notable example. In my youthful confidence, I confess I considered it highly unlikely that this information would be of any great use to me as I contemplated a future working in Scotland. In 2005, however, as Mark has mentioned, my family and I moved to the Eastern Cape of South Africa, where I was to work in theological education. There, I discovered a substantial proportion of the population among whom I lived and worked held to some form of African traditional religion. And I had to look again at the kind of material which Professor Walls had taught me more than 15 years previously. I was grateful to have the opportunity to thank Professor Walls for his lectures several years ago and to confess my short-sighted attitude in the original lectures. The global impact of Andrew Walls as a person and as a contributor to scholarship is evident from a volume of essays by friends and colleagues of Walls entitled Understanding World Christianity, published by Orbis in 2009. As the editors explain, the book is, quote, a serious and significant set of reflections on and engagements with his life, ideas, institutions, networks, publications, activities, and proposals. All but 2 of the contributors come from or work in Ghana, the USA, South Korea, and Singapore. The other 2 contributors, remaining 2, were based in Scotland, Professors I. Howard Marshall and Brian Stanley, but neither of them was Scottish by birth or parentage as far as I know. Andrew Wall's global impact, which is now widely recognized, is remarkable because it's not due to high-profile activities, you might say. Brian Stanley again explains in his tribute article. Walls never wrote a doctoral dissertation and never published an academic monograph. His extensive global influence was achieved without either of these outputs, normally deemed indispensable to launching an academic vocation in the humanities. Rather, it was built up over a lengthy career through a host of conference papers and journal and dictionary articles, through establishing key institutions and periodical publications, and through numerous doctoral students of his own, who studied at several research centres on the African continent, at the universities of Aberdeen and Edinburgh in Scotland, at Liverpool Hope University in England, and at Princeton Theological Seminary in the United States. Andrew, unlike so many academics, was never one to blow his own trumpet. His renown grew quietly without his aid, as a feature article by Tim Stafford in Christianity Today in 2007 put it, Andrew Walls may be the most important person you don't know. Now, I suspect that Andrew Walls would have hated that expression, given his unassuming nature, but it does say something about how the significance of his work has come to be understood. In the paragraph that I've just read, Brown Stanley highlights several of the contributions of Andrew Walls, which I'll highlight in this paper. Just going to put up a brief sketch. I'm not going to go through this, but what you'll see is his date of birth, 21st of April 1928. He graduated from Oxford 3 times in various qualifications, but never at doctoral level. In 1952, appointed to Tyndale House, became a Methodist local preacher in 1953, and then from 1957 through to 1966, he spends time in Africa, first of all in Sierra Leone, and then in Nigeria. Then he returns to the UK and spends the rest of his working life in the University of Aberdeen and then the University of Edinburgh, and we've already noted his death in August 2021. So what of Scotland in relation to Andrew Walls? Well, Walls was himself Scottish, although he was born in England. Brian Stanley explains Andrew Walls was born in New Milton, Hampshire, England on April 21st, 1928, of Scottish parents who had moved to the south of England in search of work. The influence of Walls' parents perhaps explains what Tim Stafford calls Walls' quote, restrained Scottish brogue, his distinctive accent, which developed despite his spending early years in England and also completing his higher education in England, though no doubt many decades in both Aberdeen and Edinburgh helped to cultivate that accent too. The significance of Andrew Walls for Scotland may be seen in several different areas, which I'll survey briefly. The first I want to highlight, perhaps surprisingly, is the local church. Andrew Walls lived his life as a follower of Jesus. His evangelical convictions become apparent to a researcher with his appointment to the position of librarian in Tyndale House in Cambridge in 1952. According to the Tyndale House website, in 1945, InterVarsity Fellowship, later UCCF, Distinctive Evangelical Student Movement, establishes Tyndale House as a, quote, library and research centre devoted to the highest and most permanent interests of biblical scholarship. So we see his evangelical convictions coming through in that appointment. In 1953, Walls became a Methodist local preacher, and his friend, Howard Marshall, who was also a Methodist local preacher, recalls several people sharing car journeys with Andrew as they travelled together to preach in nearby congregations. Howard writes, one of the side blessings of all this, of course, for the rest of us is sharing the drive to Cullen or Banff or wherever with Andrew in the car and enjoying his stimulating conversation. His range of knowledge of the past and the present is utterly encyclopedic and available on instant recall. At first, he naturally drove himself, and the journeys could be memorable for his passengers. There was the Sunday evening, for example, when the car was stuck in top gear and he did not dare stop anywhere, not even for traffic lights and halt signs, lest the car would not start again. Andrew Walls' obvious commitment to the local church, not only in attendance but in ministry through preaching, and as Marshall explains in his article, hymn writing, provides a model very much like Howard Marshall himself of integration of the calling to scholarship with the life of Christian discipleship. So Andrew Walls was significant for Scotland in terms of his contribution to the life of the local church. Next, institutional impact. From 1957 to 1966, Walls worked in Africa, first in Fura Bay College, Sierra Leone, and then at from 1962 in the University of Nigeria at Nsukka. Following his return to Scotland in 1966, Walls initially taught church history at the University of Aberdeen. He then moved to the Religious Studies department in Aberdeen. And then sometime into his period of work there, he established the Centre for the Study of Christianity in the Non-Western World in 1982. Shortly after its inauguration, however, it was necessary to find a new home for the centre. 1986, Walls joined the University of Edinburgh and moved the CSC NWW to the University of Edinburgh in 1987, a year after his arrival. The name of the centre was changed in 2010 to the Centre for the Study of World Christianity. Not only did this happily reduce the number of words in the name, but it also clearly identified the discipline which Walls had helped to establish. At the same time, it signalled a choice not to locate global expressions of Christianity primarily with reference to Western forms of Christianity. So you would have Western Christianity and non-Western Christianity, or non-Western world. So that change reflects a different attitude. The centre, currently under the co-directorship of Professor Emma Wildwood and Dr. Alex Chow, draws many research students to Edinburgh. Many represent the majority world church, perhaps reflecting both the broad theological contours of a significant proportion of global Christians and also the ethos Walls himself brought to the centre. Perhaps reflecting both of these issues, a significant proportion of students are theologically evangelical, or if they would not choose that term for themselves, robustly orthodox theologically. Several students come to study as Langham scholars, supported by the Langham Partnership, which was established by John Stott. One of Wall's significant institutional legacies is the Yale Edinburgh Group on World Christianity and the History of Mission. He is renowned for organizations with long titles. Yale Edinburgh Group is a little bit shorter, and that was founded in 1992 with his former Aberdeen colleague, Professor Lamin Sanneh, of whom more in a moment. This conference has become a focal point for scholarship and brings a significant group of established scholars and research students from all over the world to Edinburgh every second year. So there we see some of Andrew Wall's institutional impact in terms of the setting up of what is now the Centre for the Study of World Christianity, and therefore drawing to Scotland scholars, students from various parts of the world, and then the establishment of this relationship between Edinburgh and Yale, which again means that world Christianity is very much on the agenda as scholars and research students gather every second year. Students. It's evident from multiple testimonies that Andrew Walls made a very significant impact on the lives of his students, often in very personal and humble ways. It was perhaps partly due to his generous investment of time in his students that he did not publish any major monographs. One of his students who went on to a distinguished theological career was Ghanaian Kwame Bediako. In one of his final contributions before his untimely death, Bediako commented, "Professor Walls is author of many more books that can't be listed on paper. I am one of those books." And that, I think, is perhaps at least part of how we should consider Andrew Wall's output. Doubtless the impact Walls had on individuals was particularly the case when students pursued postgraduate studies under his supervision, but I've also heard testimony from numerous friends and colleagues regarding his impact on them as undergraduate students, and perhaps some of you have had that experience. Walls drew many postgraduate students to work with him. In a short obituary, Brian Stanley, Emma Wildwood, and Alexander Chow state, quote, "By Andrew's retirement, in inverted commas, from Edinburgh in 1996, almost 1/3 of the postgraduate students at New College were affiliated to the centre." So he had a disproportionate draw on students, not just him, but others associated with that work that he established, but a very significant draw. In spite of his long career in 2 Scottish universities, however, it appears that Walls supervised relatively few Scottish students. I was in touch with Brian Stanley, asked him if he could identify any. He identified one student, and there may be others that he could mention, and then one person who I thought was perhaps a Scottish student, in fact turned out to be a Northern Irish student, but I'll say more about her in a moment. So one former student, here we go, from Northern Ireland, came to Scotland specifically to study religious studies with Walls in Aberdeen, did her PhD in Edinburgh with him, then remained in Scotland throughout her distinguished career. Describing herself in personal communication as a, quote, Northern Irish Scot, she wrote that Walls' teaching, quote, completely changed the way I approached the world. She comments, the Aberdeen department he ran was groundbreaking in developing insights into how to understand intercultural challenges and the creative power of the Christian faith to shine a lens on societal structures. She continues, he was also a fascinating scholar and taught me how to be a scholar, to love learning, to interrogate material, to go to the primary sources. Reflecting on the impact Walls had on theological discussion in Scotland, she comments, I don't think the Scottish theological community understood his brilliance or the value of his work as a lens on how society relates and responds to Christianity. It is fair to say that he was a global figure recognized by many communities outside of the UK, in Singapore, West Africa, etc. But the UK theological scene, with the different theological communities and disciplinary fields, didn't quite recognize that his concepts were highly relevant. Perhaps that can be disputed in conversation, but I think it's at least fair to say that perhaps that has changed somewhat in recent years. How else has Walls impacted Scotland? Well, perhaps in some of the colleagues that he worked with. Andrew Walls worked with numerous colleagues during his many years of teaching. I want to draw attention to two colleagues with whom Walls is particularly associated and with whom he developed significant partnerships. Both had some impact in Scotland. The first I've mentioned before is Lamin Sanneh. Lamin Sanneh, 1942 to 2019, was a Gambian scholar born into a Muslim family. He converted to Christianity, to Roman Catholicism. He joined the Religious Studies Department in the University of Aberdeen from 1978 to 1981. This working relationship with Walls in Aberdeen grew into the establishment of the Yale-Edinburgh Group, mentioned previously, in 1992. Second figure, Kwame Bediako. The very colourful slide is from a recently published book on Kwame Bediako by Tim Hartman, published by Langham. And so Kwame Bediako, a brilliant scholar, born in 1945 and passed away very early in 2008. He was Walls' student who became an important collaborator. According to Brian Stanley in his excellent book, The Global Diffusion of Evangelicalism, published by IVP, Stanley comments, after theological studies at London Bible College, Bediako studied for his second doctorate at Aberdeen. He'd previously done a doctorate in France, I think perhaps Bordeaux, on negritude. And so he did his second doctorate in Aberdeen for a thesis subsequently published, which compared the theological issues raised for the church in the 2nd century by the Greco-Roman religious and philosophical heritage with those raised for modern African Christianity by the African religious past. His supervisor was the leading missiologist and scholar of world Christianity, Andrew F. Walls. Through this relationship, Walls ended up spending significant periods of time in Ghana, serving in the Akrofi Christaler Institute, in which Bediako served. And Walls, in terms of his impact on Scotland, was instrumental in bringing Bediako to Scotland as the Duff Lecturer, named after Alexander Duff, in 1988. And then on several other occasions, Stanley again says Dr. Bediako became a visiting lecturer in African theology at the Centre in Edinburgh, teaching for a term each year. Here's another opportunity for me to give a personal confession. I was a student in Edinburgh during the time Kwame Bediako was teaching at New College, yet I never went to hear him speak. As I look back, I'm frustrated at that, partly because of my own lack of insight, that this would be somebody who would have something to bring to my thinking. but also in a measure that those around me who were already more experienced theologically and in theological education didn't think that they might point me to listen to somebody that I might not recognize as being of importance for my development. So these two students, these two colleagues rather, one a student who became a colleague, they became significant partly because they were brought into the Scottish context in one way or another, and partly because they fed into the thinking. People in Scotland had the opportunity to become aware of these African scholars from the Gambia and from Ghana. And then, of course, we come to writing. While many friends and colleagues of Andrew Walls have recounted his personal impact on their lives, his writings have shaped the thinking of many others. As Brian Stanley noted in his tribute article, Andrew Walls never published a monograph, but thanks to the initiative and effort of various editors, readers have relatively easy access to a significant body of his writings. Some of his earlier writings are available online. For instance, something I learned recently, Walls was the original editor of the initial series of the journal Themelios, first published in 1962 by IFES. And just to confuse things, the UCCF then began a new series of Themelios, starting with the same numbering in 1975. So you have to dig deep to find this one. But in his brief editorial, Walls demonstrated his commitment to rigorous Christian thought and transformed Christian character, writing in the first Themelios, "The scope of Themelios is the whole of Christian theology, the entire field of the Christian pastor and theologian. In this field, all the powers of the mind are called into service, and the journal will seek to provide information and to provoke thought, sometimes about issues which today are often too lightly dismissed." Excuse me. "A humble and a loving heart," he says, "is also a requirement, and Themelios will have failed if it does nothing to stir its readers to adoration and to devotion." In this brief section, I'll identify the 4 books which bear Wall's name as author. So we have 3 of them there, plus another. And I'll comment on the collection of essays, and I'll also mention 1 or 2 other items. So just very briefly, the first collection on the far left of the slide there, The Missionary Movement in Christian History, a collection of essays published in 1996. It became a Christianity Today prize winner. The second volume, The Cross-Cultural Process in Christian History, was published in 2002. And the third collection of essays, Crossing Cultural Frontiers, and there we have Studies in the History of World Christianity as the subtitle, the first time that that language is picked up in the books. Those 3 are collections made by various editors with usually a foreword or an introduction by Walls himself, putting them in context. The 4th volume of essays there is of the nature of what we would call a festschrift, a celebratory essay collection, but it's unusual in that the authors do not simply write on their particular research topics, but they reflect on the significance of Walls' work. So if you're looking to engage with Andrew Walls' work in all its diversity, then that's an excellent place to get some context for then dipping into the collections of essays. A number of Walls' chapters in the collected essays have some specific connection to the Scottish context in which he worked. The most significant discussion of mission with respect to Scotland was his substantial 28 pages article on missions in the Dictionary of Scottish Church History and Theology, published in 1993. Whoops, there's the reference to that volume. You can, several of our distinguished participants today were involved in that publication. If I just flip back to the previous one, the most recent publication is a series of lectures that were given over a period of years, which Brian Stanley, in A Labour of Love, has put together in this volume. This is the closest, we might say, to a monograph by Walls, but it is oral delivered lectures which have then been edited by Stanley and published posthumously. Okay. Very briefly, some significant contributions. So really just identifying some thoughts that are associated with Andrew Walls. Most of these key ideas are of relevance to those who study contemporary expressions and trends of Christianity throughout the world. In other words, they're not uniquely significant to Scotland. I'll highlight several of these briefly. So I'm just going to scoot through a few. The southward swing of the Christian centre of gravity. This is particularly noteworthy as a recurrent theme in Wall's writing. If you want to know something about Christianity, he says, you must know something about Africa. The outstanding feature of 20th century religion is the southward swing of the Christian centre of gravity, which has made Christianity more a non-Western than a Western religion. For it has lost its hold on Europe and spread rapidly in Africa and the other southern continents. The next theme is when Andrew Walls speaks about the 2nd century church, and he does this in a distinctive way. He was a patristics scholar. He was engaging in his research in the 2nd century church, and with his typical humour, he says this: I still remember the force. Here he is lecturing in Africa. I still remember the force with which one day the realization struck me that I, while happily pontificating on that patchwork quilt of diverse fragments that constitutes 2nd century Christian literature, was actually living in a 2nd century church. The life, worship, and understanding of a community in its 2nd century of Christian allegiance was going on all around me. Why did I not stop pontificating, he says, and observe what was going on? The experience changed this academic for life. Instead of trying to extrapolate from the ancient corpus of literature and apply it, I began to understand the 2nd century material in the light of all the religious events going on around me. Another key theme is the notion of the Ephesian moment. And the Ephesian moment, I won't read the whole quotation, but it's really just saying that in Ephesus, in the 1st century, there was a unique situation where people from one ethnic and cultural group were meeting with another, and it was not yet clear which way the whole gathering would go. And Walls is saying, now in our day, we have that same experience, different cultural groups coming together in Christian fellowship. How will we relate to each other? The serial nature of Christian expansion. This may be significant for the Scottish context, in that Walls says that where Christianity was once strong in a particular part of the world, then in succeeding centuries, those places sometimes faded away and new strength came in new areas. And he says if that has been the pattern in which the church has grown, not by growing expansion like Islam, but rather by one place flourishing and then fading, another place coming to vitality, might that not be what we should expect as we continue in this world? That is to say, not necessarily expecting that God will continue to work in the same way in one place as he has in the past. Another key theme, the indigenizing principle, which has to be held in tension with the pilgrim principle. The indigenizing principle is that God accepts us as we are. We are conditioned by a particular time and place, by our family and group and society, by culture, in fact. In Christ, God accepts us together with our group relations, with that cultural conditioning that makes us feel at home in one part of human society and less at home in another. But combined with that is the pilgrim principle. But throughout church history, he says, there has been another force in tension with this indigenizing principle, and this also is equally of the gospel. Not only does God in Christ take people as they are, he takes them in order to transform them into what he wants them to be. Along with the indigenizing principle, which makes his faith a place to feel at home, the Christian inherits the pilgrim principle, which whispers to him that he has no abiding city and warns him that to be faithful to Christ will put him out of step with his society. For that society never existed, in East or West, ancient time or modern, which could absorb the word of Christ painlessly into its system. Provocative thought from Andrew Walls is the need for change in theological education. And I will just briefly comment on this. He says, all over the Western world, ministers are being trained and future theological scholars are being identified and taken to doctoral level and beyond without any idea of what the church of today, in which they are called to serve, is really like. Did I say it was provocative? The way that Christian thought is presented to them often implies that it is a Western religion. And again, we might say that's not the case so much these days, but that was Wall's claim. If it did not start that way, it has now become one. Church history is a case in point. And then the quotation continues, even well-read scholarly Western Christians are sometimes surprised by the statement that Africa has nearly 2,000 years of continuous Christian history, or that nearly 1,500 years of Asian church history took place before Western missionaries arrived, or that the first preaching of the gospel before the king of northern England was roughly contemporary with that before the emperor of China. What Western scholars studied as the history of the church was in reality the history of the church in our village. More seriously, nothing in their theological education has prepared them for intelligent participation in a church that is principally African, Asian, and Latin American in composition, or enabled them to realize the changed place of Western believers within that church. So I'm just going to quickly jump over the idea of Western theology is too small. There, the idea is that Western theology is affected by the Enlightenment thinking and does not have sufficient place, according to Walls, for the realm of the spirit world, which is a dominant concept within many parts of the majority world. I'm going to skip over that. Some opportunities for reflection and learning. So we might say that Andrew Walls challenges us to think about several things in the context of our Scottish context, in the context of our Scottish theological education. How does our understanding of Christianity reflect the changing shape of global Christianity? To what extent do our theological resources, methods, and approaches reflect a particular cultural context? How do we learn from global Christian voices today? And to what extent must local expressions of Christianity be subject to theological critique? Perhaps that's one area that Walls might be challenged on, that he tends to be very accepting of all local expressions. I'm not sure that that's uncritically, but perhaps there's need for further criticism. To close with a couple of, again, striking, humorous, perhaps controversial comments on his own discipline. Walls say, missiologists are the magpies of the academic world. They invade the scholarly territory of their neighbours and steal their topics. We invade the biblical field, the theological field, the historical field, and the practical field in the name of the study of mission. And then he asks this rhetorical question at the end of his most recent collection of essays: is there any more exciting vocation at the present time than missiology? Well, if that is in any way the case, then the interest and excitement is to a significant extent due to the contribution of Andrew F. Walls. Thank you.
Much, Alistair. That's great. You're very impressed with PowerPoint. I feel put to shame by the quality of that PowerPoint. Wow. So I'm learning for that. Anyway, Professor Meek, question.
Thank you. I have to thank you for that wonderful foundation.
You?
I have the privilege of knowing very well, and particularly when we were compiling and editing as one of the dictionaries of instructions was a monumental OSCNs. And that breaking label, I went into that for your never. I think apart from Nigel, I'm the only surviving editor of that work. And I wonder how I managed to survive. But one of the things that did help us all to survive was Andrew Walls. He added to our burdens greatly because when we thought we'd finished the list of topics, Andrew would come up with hundreds more. And then we couldn't find Walls. We'd get away to some exotic part of the non-Western world where nobody knew where he was. All of that the fun with Andrew Walls. But what I remember particularly is his generous, gracious inspiration to myself, working in Highland history. Nobody appreciated what I was doing more than Andrew Walls did. And he encouraged me to look at the Gallican. He was super in that. He'd often had me round to give a wee talk. It's a wonderful man. Andrew didn't fit into conventional universities. That's the long and the short of it. He always had his own institution and almost specially constructed to suit Andrew Walls's contours, which were worldwide and nowhere near as narrow as conventional universities. I always used to wonder why he was evicted the University of Aberdeen when he had built up a tremendous reputation among those who knew what he was doing. And that's an important consideration. Among his students in Aberdeen, right through the course, from his degree, undergraduate degree to postgraduate, was Dr. David Smith. And Dr. David Smith was a missionary.
Yep.
He was first of all pastor of Eden Baptist Chapel, Cambridge, then went out as a missionary to Nigeria, worked in Jos for a number of years, and then came back with a very specific goal of studying with Andrew Walls. And he did the MA and the PhD both with distinction with Andrew Walls. And in case you think that was Andrew Walls' view, I went back to Aberdeen, I worked there as a professor, and one of the lecturers in theology said to me, "You never come across a student like that." That was a quality. But the point you well made about the integrated vision, that was a wonderful thing. And I've been inspired by that down the years. That's why it was Celtic studies and religious studies and cultural studies and all of these things. That was the Walls model. Not that I absorbed it from him, it's just a natural way. But if you worked in conventional universities, you were open for misunderstanding. The academic mind had narrowed into pigeonholes. And people like Walls, well, they fitted where they touched. But he was fortunate to have his own fortress. Somehow, he must have been a consummate politician, knowing who to touch, who to, which button to press, to have these institutions. Extraordinary. I mean, in a sense, it's like having a model of UHI, which is somehow subtle. But Walls never fitted in. As I look back, I think to myself, no, and I know another person who did. I know the experience. But his inspiration transcended all these narrow and nonsensical. Because the world is big. All the little. Thank you so much for that. It was wonderful.
That's very kind. Thank you very much indeed for your helpful comments. I really appreciate your reminder that David Smith was one of his students. Is David a Scottish man or an Englishman? An Englishman. Yeah. So again, I was trying to think when Mark had initially given me the topic of how might Andrew Walls have shaped Scotland. Of course, David Smith is that kind of shape, a little bit like my Northern Irish Scot friend. People came and then lived and worked in the Scottish context for many years sometimes, and therefore made a distinct contribution. I was trying to think of any particular folks who had a distinctly Scottish heritage, but yes, David Smith's a very helpful person to be reminded of as one of Andrew's students. Also, that integrative approach that you mentioned, one of the things that caught my attention, I didn't have the time to work through all of his article in the Dictionary of Scottish Church History and Theology, but he talked about the establishment of the chair in evangelistic theology, Alexander Duff, and he comments that the intention had been that mission would permeate through the whole theological curriculum. And so he comments on when that chair was relatively quickly brought to an end, that it was perhaps one of the most significant poor decisions that had been made. And I suppose that he was thinking in terms of how it might have brought more integration among the disciplines. So thank you very much for that. I just in this and Malcolm had both had questions.
For the paper, I was just wondering when you mentioned that he talked about the narrow understanding of religion in the Western world because of enlightenment, the lack of spirituality.
Sure. Yeah.
Did he then towards the end say something about this modern upsurge of interest in spirituality in the Western world? And maybe a second question, if I could slip it in.
Yep.
Did he say anything about the challenges of spirituality in Africa's context, which opened the door for ancestors, etc.?
Helpful, thank you, Ines. So in terms of did he comment on how things had changed perhaps over time? One of the challenges of his writings is that because the collections of essays are collections, they can be at times quite considerably dated. So for instance, the 1996 collection, which is the earliest collection, that was already a collection of previously published works. So going back to 1996, which is almost 30 years ago, we might be going back, his first editorial for Themelius was in 1962. So he was in Africa at that point. And so we might well be dealing sometimes with snapshots. He says in his introduction that he didn't significantly modify the original publication form of the essays. So there is the possibility that at times you have to read his paper and say, well, actually, things have changed since then, and he may not have commented because the original publication was long past. I think perhaps so I'm not aware of any more recent reflections on the changing nature. I think that notion of Christianity being too small, he is particularly thinking about the notion of the spiritual realm, that to a large extent he thinks Westerners and even Western Christians who would hold Orthodox theology don't think in terms of that spiritual realm as being a present reality around us in the same way as typically would people in Africa or Asia, let's say. So I'm not aware of anything that sort of updated his reflections. Even his lectures that were turned into the history of the Western missionary movement are probably originally from 2008, 9, 10, that sort of dating. And I'm not sure that I can't recall anything specifically that dealt with that question. In terms of the risks of spiritual openness to the spiritual realm, that I think is one of the areas where there might be legitimate questions raised. I noticed in the most recent edition of Themelios, there was a review, a very positive review of the more recent collection of essays, I think it was, by Ed Smither. And he just raises that question, could there sometimes be more reflection on where there are strengths and weaknesses in local expressions of Christianity? Are there some places that you may need to raise critique over? Perhaps that goes with the issue of what world Christianity is as a discipline, because world Christianity is primarily, you might say, a sociological, empirical discipline. It says, what do people say that they are? How do they present themselves? So, for instance, in the typical statistics that you get today, and there are various places you can get those statistics, the statistics about the number of Christians in the world today are those who self-identify as Christians. And sometimes that includes people who, those who are creedally orthodox, hold to the traditional creeds, would regard as simply far beyond that creedal boundary. So it is a complex business studying world Christianity where you accept the position that anyone who claims to be Christian is incorporated in that group. Now, of course, it's hard to find an alternative way of measuring, because what do you measure in terms of statistics if it's not just what people say? But it does lead to that very inclusive approach. And I think I don't recall again that there was anywhere that Walsh raised that concern that this is going beyond the bounds of orthodoxy or such like. He seems to be relatively accepting. At the same time, however, I think we've got to balance that with the fact that when he does speak of what Christianity is in some of his essays, he is very rooted on an orthodox Christological approach. And so while he doesn't always address that and apply it to some of the other topics he addresses, I think that that's lying at the heart of his understanding of what Christianity really is. It's an orthodox approach to Jesus. So the short answer is I'm not aware of where he addresses the kind of issues that you've raised, and I'll certainly have a look to see if I can see anything there.
Who was next?
Malcolm, was it?
Once you get me started on, it's hard to stop me, because possibly I was one of few Scottish ministers who did begin to see the importance of walls for our context. And I have to say that was out of my own experience of Africa. I first met Walls in 1975 when he hosted a CU coffee party. That tells you something of the kind of man he was. He had a pastoral concern, he had broad interests. He was a Labour politician on the Aberdeen Council. He used to have lunchtime meetings in the museum, a chat with Finlay Anderson. He was Andrew Finlay Walls. How he managed, we don't know. He had 2 serious heart attacks in his 50s, and he wasn't expected to survive. So the fact that he went on till he was in his 90s teaching is, well, it's a testimony to the perseverance of the saints, I think. I think for me, I want to come back to 2 other things. You couldn't cover everything in one. There's about 10 different people in Andrew.
Yeah.
But his theology of conversion and his theology of translation or conversion and proselytization, I think are very significant insights. And probably I want to preface that by saying that these were things, they were like little time bombs that he would drop. I was persuaded by Professor Marjorie Harper, some of you will know her, who was a year ahead of me in doing history in Aberdeen. to take Andrew's course on the missionary movement from the West as an honours option. And I did that and loved it. Then went 2 years to Africa, came back to do theology, and did as many options I could in religious study with Kwame, with Andrew, with Jim Thrower, who was an atheist. I met David Smith first day he arrived at University in Aberdeen at the Africa prayer group, and there was just the two of us there. And David has also been a great mentor to me, and I wish I had been able to do postgraduate studies with Andrew. I did end up doing a master's degree in interfaith studies, and Andrew's outlines and understanding of how the gospel connects with cultures helped me to understand the Nestorians going to China. And the thing I would love to be able to do, or someone should do, but they would need to understand Syriac and Chinese, and possibly, is to do something on the Nestorian church in China, India, and the Middle East. But his thinking on conversion is that conversion was not leaving everything to become something new, but rather turning what is there to Christ. And I think that might answer some of the questions about that. We all know there are loose ends in Andrew's thinking, and it's very frustrating. He didn't speak as a systematic theologian. He spoke as a historian. That, I think, and together with the notion of the Pilgrim principle, probably safeguards his thinking from becoming too loose.
Sure. Yeah.
And the other thing about conversion rather than proselytism, would be the translatability of the gospel, the importance of the gospel taking root in indigenous cultures. And I think these are very important insights for our church today. And it's constantly made me ask, why did so few Scottish and particularly ministerial students do postgraduate studies with them? I can think of quite a few who did postgraduate studies, but they weren't necessarily evangelical Christians. And so their thinking would have been very different.
Sure.
But I do think that these time bombs that he planted, I would say some of them he planted in the 1970s only kind of exploded like 20, 30 years ago for me.
It's really helpful, Malcolm. Thank you very much. Just again, the comment on the translatability that came into my mind when Ebby was speaking and when Professor Meek was speaking. That you raised that question yesterday, but both Walls and Lamansani would have emphasized that Christianity is inherently translatable, and that marks it out for Walls in comparison with, particularly with Islam, where both in terms of cultural expression and linguistically in terms of the scriptures, there is a true version, and even if there are modifications made for different contexts, they're not quite the true version. Whereas for Christianity, even in terms of the Septuagint, you've got right from the start, the scriptures are translated, and then from a very early stage, you've got local expressions of Christianity coming through with different cultural communities. So yeah, very important, not just for understanding the ancient context, but also for Gaelic Bible translation and such like. It all flows into that.
Yes, at the back.
Thank you. My old professor, Willie McKean, said that the Old Testament prophets were intellectual giants among pygmies. What a punchy statement. But prophetic ministry, prophetic teaching has appeared in the 20th century. People still think that Bonhoeffer has some prophetic voice for our age today. You know, the idea of consumer Christianity and some supermarket Christianity. We pick it up from the shelf, we put it down. But the big challenges of today, which are being acted out in wars, is the global competition, globalization.
Mm.
To what extent was Andrew Walls in some ways prophetic, 50 years ahead of his time, for the challenges of today?
Thanks for that. I would certainly be happy to use the language of prophetic with a small p, in the sense, even theologically, that God raises up people who see the world with a distinct sight, which we might say is an act of God's grace, which then benefits the wider community. And I would say that he certainly raised a number of challenges. Going back to Malcolm's comments, sometimes it was more that there would be an idea that would appear in various forms in different locations, but it would get re-emphasized. And that, I think, was a little bit like the time bomb situation. Perhaps initially people didn't see the significance of it, and then as time goes on and further reflection goes on, then they see the significance. I'm trying to think whether there would be particular ways in which he would have cut into a specific context. One thing he talks about a lot is migration as a key factor in the development of Christianity. One of his doctoral students, Jehu Hanseals, who's now teaching in the States, he's written quite a lot on this migration emphasis, and that Christianity spread to a large extent, especially in the early days, not by mission in the way that it is sometimes conceived of, that delegated, authorized people are sent out with a particular task, but often because Christians were scattered. So Acts 8, it's regular people find themselves dispersed, whether by captivity or by persecution or whatever it might be, and they testify to their Christian faith in that new context. So perhaps now, as we are in our wider world so conscious of the impact of migration, which probably wasn't something that was on my agenda so much a decade ago. Andrew Walls was speaking about that a long time ago, and was talking about the migration from the West, the various reasons that people moved to the Americas, to the Antipodes, and so on. But now a new migration of believers from different parts of the majority world who are moving into different places, testifying to their Christian faith, and in many respects also coming into that serial expansion idea of the Christianity, not necessarily growing in a continuous curve, but as the Western Church has diminished in certain parts, in much of Western Europe, so now that migration emphasis of people coming from other parts of the world feeds in a new vitality as a kind of counterbalance to the original migration. So I think in many ways Andrew Walls is prophetic, again with a small p, but I think that issue of migration comes to mind as one that he was speaking about, that he was working with his students on at a relatively early stage, which has now come to be regarded as a huge issue, both for good and ill, within the wider world. He was already reflecting on its significance, certainly from a Christian point of view, a good while ago. So thank you for the question. I hope that's of some help.
Very good.
The comment that Andrew was giving to the Western world is to challenge them to listen to the believers or missionaries or theologians from the majority world was quite encouraging.
Mm.
And because we have heard most of the times from the East perspective, I'm speaking, there are many Western theologians who would ask, can anything good come from the majority world?
Mm.
So that was quite challenging as well as encouraging.
Yeah.
But my main question regarding Wall's principle is indigenizing principle, or letting Christians have their own theology or their cultural expressions.
Sure.
To what extent, or where do we draw the line?
Sure.
Has he written much on it, or has he just spoken in few lectures, but he hasn't elaborated on it?
The honest answer is I'm not aware of where he sort of draws lines. I think what he gives us are trajectories in those two principles. So he holds these two principles together. So you can't have the indigenizing principle without the pilgrim principle. So the indigenizing principle says any believer can feel at home in their Christian faith, in their culture. The pilgrim principle says no believer can feel entirely at home in their culture, because no culture can embody fully what it means to be part of the kingdom of God. So that tension, I think, inherently should give some sense of boundary to where cultural expression in a particular locality can work out. Because if the indigenizing principle is given the full reign, so that you allow the fullest adopting of local cultural expression into your Christianity, then you're losing sight of that pilgrim principle. So ideally, it's a bit like two pools that keep you in tension, and that it's a constant balancing process. So I'm not aware of anything that he says this is where to draw the line. I think that perhaps along the lines of what you were saying initially, Isaac, what he has encouraged us to do, particularly if we are from the West, is to listen to the voices of people from the different locations, and to encourage, wherever we may be located, other believers in a particular location to make those decisions for themselves on the basis of their Christian convictions. So perhaps wherever we might be, the risk is that we take on the role, and we may take the role on ourselves, of being the theological and ecclesial police, that we ensure that others behave in the correct ways. Otherwise, perhaps a more risky, but perhaps a more creative approach is to be the body of Christ together, encourage us to be constantly coming to the scriptures to test where we sit in relation to the indigenizing principle and the pilgrim principle, but allowing the people in a particular community to make those decisions rather than to impose them from elsewhere. And that's perhaps particularly a danger for those of us in the West who have had lots of resources, lots of heritage, and so on. So I don't think there's an easy answer to your question. It's a very good question, but I think that the holding together of those two principles would be where I would see some measure of protection from going too far in one direction or the other.
I didn't think I had a question, but I do have a question. Does grace perfect nature? Or is nature taken to the cross, dies, and then is resurrected in a completely new thing? That would be the overarching comment over my question. I was only in Africa for a short time, 5 years or so, but quite quickly, what came to me was the complete relevance, strangely, of 19th and 20th century debates on the relationship between faith and culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that these things that I had learned about theoretically, Karl Barth, German culture, etc., now became absolute practical existential questions, because you could see the same thing reflected. And then in my work on Robert Moffat, early 19th century London Missionary Society missionary in Southern Africa. And what Robert Moffat, to me, exemplifies is what we call the drum question. Are drums to be used in Christian worship, or are they not? Now, Moffat would say no, because in his situation, hearing the drums did three things. The drums spoke of war, the drums spoke of initiation ceremonies, or the drums spoke of idol worship. And so in that front line setup, they had to say to new Christians, no drums. Because in these early days, they had to make a break between what was believed before and what was now believed.
Yeah.
Now, later on, once that separation had been made, in later generations beyond Moffat's time, drums were reintegrated into Christian worship. But that break had to be made.
Yeah.
Columba had to do the same thing. You had to make the break in order to create a distance with something that could be later brought in. Now, when Andrew was in Nigeria and these places, he was coming to a culture already Christianized. He wasn't coming to a culture which was totally frontline.
Sure.
Do you think his thinking would have been changed by that, or no?
A really interesting question, and I'm not sure that I would dare to think of what Andrew might have thought in a different situation. I absolutely hear what you're saying there. I wonder whether, in terms of the drum question, I suppose one of the issues we have to wrestle with is, again, this issue of how are Christians in one part of the world to relate to a Christian community, even a brand new Christian community in another part of the world. Saying to somebody that I've been working through Nigel Bigger's book on colonialism, which is a very interesting book, and just published in the last little while, and a volume that was quite brave and quite controversial. But he talks about the possibility that some actions in the past by Western missionaries or various imperial powers may not have been, as they're sometimes characterized in current debates, racist or domineering, but they might still have been paternalistic. And I suppose that's one of the challenges we have. He quotes somebody whose name escapes me at the moment, but saying it's right that we protect the peoples from themselves effectively if it's for their well-being. Now, I think we can see that that's quite a complex situation to be in. And again, I just wonder whether what Andrew Walls challenges us to do is to say, how can we help each other, encourage each other, but not get into a position where we are taking responsibility for another. Now, that, of course, that's the difficult. Even in the New Testament, you're seeing new groups of believers, but then you're seeing some oversight from the apostles and some guidance and direction. So it's not wrong for those who have already some maturity in Christianity, some faith, to come in and to provide direction. But also, I suppose we're having to think, how might we avoid stepping over that into a position where we are determining what is good or safe? And I'm not sure that there is an easy way to judge that. And I suppose part of the benefit of looking at the figures who have gone before us, who have wrestled with these issues, is you can at least see the rationale that they used for what decisions they made, whether or not you would make the same decisions. So yeah, really good questions. I think Andrew certainly sees culture in that indigenizing and pilgrim principle. What's brought into Christian faith is what is in Christ. So anything that comes from the culture has to be compatible with Christ. I suppose on the drum question, you might say, okay, those drums are associated with certain issues. Is that all they're associated with? And again, you mentioned the fact that after a period of time, the associations may not be so strong and that the drums could be used then. So I suppose what I would say is that Andrew challenges us to step carefully in our engagement across cultures and not to be too bold in determining for another group what is appropriate and what's not.
We're running out of time. I just got one kind of half question, or a kind of.
Can I give a half answer?
No, yeah, exactly. It's that kind of thing. Just when you were talking there about Brian, I came to mind that Brian Stanley had an apology for the missionary movement. I think it was his first book that IBP brought out. I think it was called The Bible and the Flag or something like that. There's a bit of a kind of soft apology for what they're cultivating the missionaries and so on and so forth. And apropos of that, in 2010, I think you said that Edinburgh University New College decided to call it the Centre for World Christianity. Yeah. But then in Andrew's very kind of almost not his last words, but kind of 2017 or something, he's still calling it missiology and mission studies.
Yeah.
And is that to do with the idea that you can't really integrate anything with world Christianity, but you can integrate theology with missiology? Is that the difference?
So a helpful question, Mark. Thank you. I guess it is a matter of definitions. And I would say that effectively with world Christianity and with missiology, you have like a Venn diagram. You have interlocking circles, but not coextensive circles, so that missiology would be the study. If you took even a relatively narrow definition of mission, let's say the expansion of Christianity. World Christianity doesn't necessarily discuss the expansion of Christianity. It may just be what you see at a particular moment in a particular community. So even if the church isn't expanding in that place, it's still world Christianity because it's an encounter with that particular expression. What's interesting, though, is that world Christianity and missiology merge so closely in some respects, and so there's distinction, I think, but there's overlap. And so I think for me, as I teach missiology, it's inconceivable for me not to introduce the students to the concept of world Christianity, even though that may be a slightly different technical definition. So yeah, I think Andrew would continue to use both world Christianity for that perhaps more sociological approach. Brian actually has an interesting article in a book I think that you edited, where, or if you didn't edit it, you contributed to it, on the end of theology from the Tyndale Fellowship. And Brian's concern in that book, which is quite interesting, is that he says sometimes we reduce our study of Christianity to a purely sociological study, just to look at what is happening. And he's concerned that we lose that theological element, which says this is what Scripture says about what God is doing. So I think Brian Stanley, as the Professor Emeritus of World Christianity, was still urging that we go a little bit beyond the technical limitations of that discipline, and that we move into what might be described more as a theological approach to missiology. So yeah, similar fields, but I think distinct and distinguishable, even where they overlap.
The number 1910 comes to mind. That's another day. But just if you're in Edinburgh,
sure,
and you're doing this, and you've got the kind of the mixed blessing that 1910 is. I mean,
yeah, absolutely. So that's the kind of world Christianity. It's reflecting on that whole history. The missiology might ask what might have been done better and what might we want to do. So just one last comment. If this talk is of any use to you, then I would certainly hope that you would go and dig into Andrew Walls. And if you have already dug into Andrew Walls, dig into Brian Stanley as a good next step. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just wondering if Walls's scholarship impacted your teaching in Dumasani, or if your engagement with Walls is more recent than that.
Yeah.
How would your teaching, if you were called back to Dumasani tomorrow, would your teaching be any different because of your engagement with Walls?
I think it would. Great question, and I can't recall. I mean, as I say, I had these encounters with Andrew Walls way back in my undergraduate studies, and I don't think I felt any great frustration that, for instance, I didn't go the few yards between the Free Church College and New College to hear Kwame Bediako. I don't think I felt anything about that in my early years. It was when I started to reflect, how am I deliberately listening to Christian brothers and sisters who are laboring and reflecting on Christian theology from a different context? I thought, I just blanked the possibility of hearing from this person, despite now knowing that that person was a very significant voice. But because it didn't seem to fit into my notions of what I would do, I just left it out. So I think, as I reflect back on our time in South Africa, I think I probably went and did some of the things that Andrew Wall critiques. For instance, he talks about the traditional Scottish curriculum of theology, and it's just then exported into Africa. And I think that some of my colleagues were more sensitive to that than perhaps I was. I think that maybe my engagement with Walls has been more recent, and it's perhaps been because I was thinking, I mean, I remember picking up at least one or two of Walls' books as we were preparing to go out to South Africa. But I think it was only as we were actually in context that I started to see what that might look like. And therefore, sadly, the years of context were passing before I quite was able to grasp some of the significance of what I was learning. So yeah, it was definitely a symbiotic relationship. And I think I would certainly do things rather differently, not least try to have voices that reflect the culture and the content, the context of the people I was working with.
Well, thank you, Alistair. We've certainly got full value out of you this morning. I think you and possibly the rest of us deserve to have a lunch break. Bruce, have you anything to say about that? We need any instructions on how to eat your lunch?
No, I don't think we need instructions for that. We're giving Andrew Alistair such a tough session was punishment for leaving us in the first place. Thank you. Can we just give thanks before we go for lunch?
Father, we thank you for the spiritual food that you've given us in these hours together, and pray that you would continue to bless our fellowship one with the other, and as we return thanks to you for the food that will be set before us in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.